everyone. I think we'll get started. My name is Jenny Wüstenberg. I am one of the co-presidents of the Memory Studies Association, and I'm based at Nottingham Trent University. And it's my pleasure today to briefly introduce the second event in our new MSA digital series. So as everyone else, we're of course trying to find ways to gather virtually during this pandemic, but we've always thought that the Memory Studies Association should be a place not where we just meet once a year for a conference, but where we engage and share in other ways as well. So we're very happy to be kicking this off now with the second event. If you're not a Memory Studies Association member, maybe you want to go to our website and check it out and see all the different ways that you can get engaged other than with events like this. Like you can join working groups and regional groups and national networks and look at all the resources on our website. Today's event is co-organized with Ghent University's Cultural Memory Studies Initiative, and it features someone I've known for quite a long time and whose work I've known for quite a long time. So I'm especially excited for Sarah Gensburger to be speaking today. And I'm just going to briefly introduce the two facilitators and moderators of this event, and they will then introduce Sarah properly. So Stef is a professor of English literature at Ghent University, and he directs the Cultural Memory Studies Initiative, which is a research group that brings together scholars from across the humanities who work on issues of memory and trauma as mediated through culture. And he's also, importantly for us, a member of the MSA Executive Committee. His recent publications include the new critical idiom volume Trauma from this year, which is co-authored with Lucy Bond, and a guest editor's special issue of American Imago on ecological grief. The second facilitator is Catherine Gilbert, who is an academic track fellow at Newcastle University, so not too far from me. And her current research project focuses on genocide commemorations in the Rwandan diaspora. She is the author of From Surviving to Living, Voice, Trauma, and Witness in Rwandan Women's Writing, which, again, very important for us, won the Memory Studies Association Outstanding First Book Award last year. And she's also co-edited a volume that came out this year together with Kate McLaughlin and Neil Monroe, the volume on commemoration, global reflections upon remembering war. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Stef and Catherine.
Okay, thank you, Jenny, for that kind introduction. And hello, everyone. I'm delighted that so many of you have been able to join us today, whether on Zoom or on YouTube, because this event is also being live streamed on the MSA's YouTube channel. I'm used to organizing on-campus events that attract only a fraction of the turnout for this online event. It's enormously exciting and gratifying to have people tuning in from literally all over the place. Even so, we'd appreciate it if everyone who is not a speaker could mute themselves for now, if you haven't done so already. And it'd be great also if everyone who doesn't need to be seen could turn off their cameras as well. This decreases bandwidth needs and might help people who have a poor internet connection. Right, with that little bit of housekeeping out of the way, I'd like to introduce our guest. Catherine and I are thrilled at the opportunity to engage in conversation with Sarah Gensburger today. That's how she's known in the Francophone world. She goes by Sarah Gensburger in English. Sarah is a political scientist at the CNRS, the French National Center for Scientific Research in Paris, where she studies the social dynamics of memory. She works at the intersection of political science, ethnographic sociology, and contemporary historiography. Among her latest publications are Memory on My Doorstep, Chronicles of the Bataclan Neighborhood, Paris 2015-2016 from last year, and Beyond Memory, Can We Really Learn from the Past, which she co-authored with Sandrine Lefranc and which was published this year. Both of these books were translated from French. This is just the tip of the iceberg, but in the interest of time, I won't mention Sarah's numerous other accomplishments. Our conversation today will focus on two of her recent projects. The first one is the book that one of the books that I just mentioned, Memory on My Doorstep, which traces the evolving memorialization processes following the 2015 terrorist attacks in Paris and their impact on the local landscape. Memory on My Doorstep is both an academic text and a deeply personal response to these traumatic events. It takes the form of an auto-ethnographic sociological chronicle of memory and memorialization in the year after the attacks. Sarah lives in the city's 11th arrondissement, on the same street as the Bataclan concert hall, and also in the direct vicinity of the Charlie Hebdo offices that were attacked in January 2015, and the cafes and restaurants targeted along with the Bataclan in November that same year. In the book, she describes her surprise at finding that all of a sudden, and I quote, social phenomena, which I was used to studying in other places and periods, were now unfolding in my own neighborhood on my doorstep. And that observation is what gave the book its title, Memory on My Doorstep. The book consists of a series of diary entries with Sarah's observations of and reflections on various aspects of the memorialization processes that she saw happening around her in real time over the year that followed the attacks. These entries are accompanied by numerous photographs that Sarah took herself, and you will get to see a selection of these in the course of this conversation. The book poses a key question that will be central to our discussion today. How can we grasp the social dynamics of memory in times of crisis? In the second part of the conversation, we will discuss another exciting and even more recent project of Sarah's, Windows in Lockdown, which finds her collaborating with Marta Severo. Windows in Lockdown documents public responses to the current coronavirus pandemic from different sites across Europe through the creation of a photographic archive of public space. Everyone is invited to take photos of the messages that they see displayed in shop windows or on public buildings, and to share these on social media or on the project website. The aim is to collectively create a vast photographic record of this extraordinary period, which will constitute a unique resource for future memory studies research. As for the format of today's event, once I'm done with this little introduction, Catherine will ask Sarah some questions. I'll then take over from Catherine to ask her a few more, and so on and so forth. We'll basically be taking it in turns. However, after an hour or so, we'll open the discussion to questions from the audience. There are two ways in which you can ask a question. You can use either the hand-raising function or the chat. If you want to put your question directly to Sarah, then please click the raise hand link in the participants panel and wait to be called upon. In case you're not familiar with this Zoom feature, the raise hand link can be found at the bottom of the participants panel that pops up when you click on participants in the meeting controls. Clicking on raise hands will put the raise hand icon next to your name. When I call on you, turn on your camera so that we can actually see each other, unmute yourself and ask your question. So that's the raise hand function. The other way to ask a question is to use the chat function. We've disabled the chat for now, as you might have seen, to avoid distraction, but we will enable it at the start of the Q&A. So please save your questions till then. You'll be able to write your questions in the chat at that point. Catherine will be monitoring the chat and she will read them out. Either way, we'd appreciate it if you could ask actual questions instead of making comments. And please also refrain from using the chat for parallel discussions. We obviously can't guarantee that we'll get around to all of the questions, but we'll do our best. You can also help with that by keeping your questions short and to the point. We plan to keep this event to an hour and a half to avoid Zoom fatigue setting in. So let's collectively try to make the best possible use of that limited time that we have. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Catherine.
Okay, thank you, Stef. And I'd like to echo your thanks to everyone for being here and to Sarah for agreeing to take part in this. And of course, to the support of the CMSI at Ghent University and also the Newcastle University Centre for Heritage, who have co-sponsored this event. So to open the conversation then, I think what is particularly striking in your book, Sarah, is your individual trajectory and how in the wake of the 2015 attacks, your personal life has really become inflected by the research. So I suppose I'd like to start with the broad question. If you could just say a little bit more about your experience of doing research in your everyday environment. So what does it mean to be in the research site rather than outside it? And how does this affect your sociologist's gaze? Sorry, you're on mute.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you for this first question, which summarized very clearly what I tried to do. And before I answer, I just, of course, want to thank you and Stef for all this work, and Jenny and the whole MSA to give me the opportunity to discuss it with everyone online, and also maybe to try to take a stand on the way I intend to do memory studies as a social scientist. So as Stef told you in its introduction, I'm a social scientist, and I work sometimes as an historian and sometimes as a political scientist. But first and foremost, I describe myself as a sociologist of memory. I study mainly public policies of remembrance and their appropriation, as well as the vernacular relationship to the past and its presence in contemporary society. So I don't want to speak of my past work, but just I say that to understand from where I speak in doing this work on memory on my doorstep. So when November 13, 2015 happened in France, the media, as well as the new huge research projects that were put together in the immediate aftermath of the event were focused exclusively on the traumatic dimension. And everything was labeled in this way, using this vocabulary. For example, the neighborhood I was living in was labeled as a traumatic neighborhood. And all the media, all the press articles were wondering how people could still live there, why they were not all moving out. Because also you need to remember that this is the same neighborhood which was attacked in January 2015 with a so-called Charlie Hebdo attack. And everything is very close, spatially. So, and the first and still main research project in France, which has been driving millions of euros, is an oral history project based at recording testimonies from witnesses linked to the attack. And the category of the witnesses is based on their traumatic relationship to the event. The people from the neighborhood being the second circle, so supposedly less traumatized, of course, than the victims themselves, but more than people living further away from the attacks. So this is the general context where my research started. And since I was living in this so-called traumatized neighborhood, it raised some questions in my mind. First, the first question was, did this characterization of my neighborhood help me to make sense of anything I was experiencing and seeing in this neighborhood? And the second, and maybe more importantly, the second question was what this event had changed in my life. The attacks took place on a Friday, and even if it was difficult, I took the kids to school on Monday, and their school, as you saw on the map, is at the middle of the two places of the attack, the Charlie Hebdo and the Bataclan. And I went on going to work, eating, taking showers, making shopping, etc., etc. So that's why you asked me about continuity and rupture. So that's why my questioning really started with this personal experience of social continuity. And of course, it was not the decision to reject trauma as an explanatory variable, but to give me the authorization to look at things from a different perspective, leave it open the fact to meet trauma on the way or not. So you asked me how I worked. So I will say I used 3 tools to work. I use ethnography, I use my children, and I'm going to explain a little bit more, and maybe it will be one of the topics for the Q&A. And I use photography. So I want to make it short, so I just explain a little bit. The first thing, I took notes of everything of my life, every day during 1 year. And the idea was to pay attention to all these ordinary conversations I had with my neighbors, with the parents at school, with the people in the shops, everything. Because as a sociologist, my dream is always to be there in ordinary life of people, but we cannot do that. And for example, we use interview, we use focus group, we use everything to try to recreate that. And I felt I was, in a way, very lucky to have the opportunity to do that in my real life. So of course it raises some ethical questions. Maybe we can also address that in the Q&A. The second thing, and in doing that, I try to pay attention to the differences, to the very basic social differences between people, their level of education, their level of income, who they lived in the neighborhood, the type of kids they had, their marital status, and so on. I'm a very plain sociologist, nothing sexy about that. Second thing, I was doing my work embedded in my everyday life, and being a mother, my everyday life, and they were very young, so my everyday life was very much with my children. They were 4 and 7 by the time, and it at first I felt it as a burden because I thought, oh, they will always be there. But finally, it was a resource for me, a research resource, because they commented everything. They were always there, and their eyes helped me to distance myself from the things that seemed obvious and normal for me as an adult and as someone who has been working on memory for such a long time. And so I really included some of their comments in my work, and they were very much sensitive to conflicts, to, in a way, politicization, everything because everything was supposed to be so traumatic, everything for me, which I, at the beginning, did not see. And they were sensitive to that. And the last thing is the use of pictures. So I took picture everywhere, every time, always. It was a kind of ethnographic visual notes for me, and it helps me not to qualify what I was seeing at the beginning, but to leave it open maybe for later and for other interpretation, other discussion, etc. And maybe we will come back to that also, because it is also a tool of restitution for the public, the pictures, not only a tool of analysis, but also a tool of writing in a way. And the last thing, I also try to look differently to those people who came to the places to visit or to leave a message or something, because the researchers were there, the journalists, everyone went to these people and said, why do you bring some tributes here? Why did you come to mourn? And so I tried, since I decided to see my place of living as a point of departure and not as a site of memory in itself, I tried to come to these people, and my first question will be, for example, do you often come there? Do you often visit the neighborhood? Do you often, so it was really the place in its more mundane definitions that I use as a resource also to go to people who were outside my everyday life and my more ordinary interactions. Maybe that's enough for the first answer, because I want to leave some time
That's fantastic. I think in many ways you've already covered a lot of the ground that I wanted to ask about in my second question. So I think what's really interesting in your book is the fact that you do take issue with the fact that much of memory studies actually focuses on traumatic memory as being ontologically distinct from everyday memory. So yeah, there is this sense of this emphasis on a rupture rather than a continuity. And I think by contrast, what you draw attention to in the book is very much this coexistence of traumatic memory and everyday memory. So everyday memory is actually at the very core of remembering traumatic events. And you've made a conscious decision, I suppose, to move away from that trauma-driven perspective by considering your own neighborhood as a space where people are not just victims, but also live and interact with one another and with their environment. So in that respect, I thought it was significant that what first gave you the idea for the book, as you've been talking about, the book's point of origin was actually the liberating experience of being able to walk on the pavement in front of the Bataclan again towards the end of December 2015. So that pavement had actually been blocked off for more than a month in the wake of the attacks. But that physical blockage or rupture finally gave way to a resumption of normal life. And that's sort of what you can see in the images on the screen here. So would it be possible to elaborate a little bit more on that tension that you see between trauma and the everyday, between rupture and continuity, and how you negotiate that in your work?
Yeah, as I said, the thing is, I try to see where, when, who, in which situation did people speak about the event. And this was the way I tried to link this issue of continuity and rupture. And also, when I say who, is not only who regarding to the status of victim or of losing someone, but also who, given the use they have to speak publicly, to express their feelings, the issue of gender, for example. And so it was not the idea of not paying attention to trauma, but trying to put trauma and the way people deal with it into more classical sociological characteristics, for example, such as gender. It was really, that's why I pay attention so much to ordinary conversation, to children interaction, and to the fact, for example, that some people went to do their shopping to the farmers markets, and they stopped to the grassroots memorial on the way back. So what was that? Was it an act of memory, or was it an act of going to the farmers markets? This is this tension between how you normalize something as part of your everyday life that you are not used to, but you try to make sense of it anyway.
Yeah, I think as well what you've touched upon is the role of emotions, I suppose, in your research as well. I'm not going to ask you to talk too much about that, but perhaps that's something we can touch on in the Q&A. But I just, you know, this attention to trauma and to burdening the children, but then also how things do normalize and become part of everyday situations. I thought that was fascinating in the book. But I wanted to turn now to talk a little bit more about more formal processes of institutionalization of memory and heritage. So in the book, Memory on My Doorstep, I think there were so many fascinating elements. So firstly, there was the rapidly changing nature of the memorial and the memorial space. And there was also the tensions that you pointed out between the grassroots groups, such as 17 plus jamais, or 17 never again, which was a group that became, I suppose, the unofficial caretakers of the memorial in the Place de la République for many months, and the role of the city authorities, who gradually took over the collecting and archiving of the material. And there's also a shift from what you talk about in terms of consensual forms of memory to more overtly and often conflicting political uses of the space. So it's really this coexistence of multiple different dynamics at work in the construction of memory. But I think one thing that really struck me was what you describe as a moving away from the time of mourning into the time of official commemoration. So this shift from spontaneous memory to a more kind of structured construction of heritage, if you like. So could you explain a little bit more about the stages involved in this process? And are we able to determine general traits based on what you've seen, or do these processes remain specific to a place and a time?
Okay, I think what will be general in the things I studied in the book is the first thing will be the fact that you don't have a clear distinction between ephemeral and permanent and grassroots and official. And I think it's not only the case for the Paris situation. For example, the picture you saw of the Place de la République with the caretakers, the thing is, the first official monument inaugurated in Paris in memory of the attack was inaugurated in January 2016. Because when November 13 happened, it was almost the first anniversary of January. And for this first anniversary, the city of Paris and the French government had planned to plant 17 trees, which referred to the number of victims of January. And of course, since November happened, they could not plant Place de la République, which is not that big, 147 trees. So they decided to plant only one, which is called the memory oak, and to add a plaque on this tree. So was very, very specific is the fact that they inaugurated this official tree memorial, like 10 meters away from the grassroots memorial, which was still there and huge and really, really alive. And as a result, indeed, this memory oak was never appropriated by neither the population, not even the political world, and it died. But the second things between this relation between permanent and ephemeral, grassroots and official, is that, as you said, the Paris Archive made permanent what was supposed to be ephemeral. So I need to explain a little bit. For those who are not familiar with the French tradition, there's not at all any public history tradition in France. Everything is very state focused and state monitored. So when January happened, there was any initiative of collecting anything from the streets of Paris. The only initiative which took place was based in the US. Actually, it was in Harvard with the Charlie Archives project. So everything was destroyed. In November, it was slightly different because one of the new issues was the urban space. The things were so huge, as I said, and as you saw in the picture, we couldn't even walk on the pavement anymore because to go to school, we need to pass by the Bataclan. And every day I'm used to walk by this pavement. And we had to go actually on the streets where the cars were riding. So it was not only an heritage situation, but it was simply a public monitoring of urban space situation. So that's why actually, it's not for memory issues. That's why the Paris Archive decided to collect everything. And so one of the things I decided to do in this project was also to study this collection, to study how ephemeral became permanent and which choices were made, because I was fully aware, coming from memory studies field, that all this heritage will become the object of dispute, of political uses, of cultural uses. So I wanted to be at the very beginning of the way this collection was going to be elaborated. So I can come back to that in the Q&A too, but there was a lot of conflict between these caretakers that you spoke about and the city. And also the city had to make choices. For example, there were a lot of flags on these grassroots memorials, which is very interesting. And I wrote a new piece since about the presence of foreigners and migrants on these grassroots memorials, but all the flags were destroyed. Almost none of them were curated because Paris Archives only curate papers, photographs, and not objects. And so, and also they said that if we keep 2 or 3 French flags, 1 or 3 Spanish, Italian, etc., it's enough. We don't need to be exhaustive. So, and this has to be, the traces of that also needs to be kept, because one of the, and it crosses the issue of windows in lockdown. One of the things I wanted to make was also to put into perspective this new material and sources that a lot of researchers, but also citizens will use in the future. And actually already now, there are a lot of conflicts and issues over this collection, because you asked me about this permanent institutionalization of memory. And actually in 2018, the French president decided that France is going to have a museum on terrorism. So it's a long story, but I'm trying to make it short. And it's been reframed as a museum of societies facing terrorism. And of course, actually in the French definition, a museum needs to have a collection. And it will be a national museum, and this archives collection is for the city. So there are a lot of conflicts now to who is going to own this collection, especially because this grassroots expression by citizens, and that no definitive narrative by the state has been forged so far. So they need that in a way to do a second order narrative, to use how people spoke of the event to try to frame a kind of political discourse.
It's fascinating. And I suppose that makes me want to ask, how have the processes evolved since you finished writing the book, and particularly this year during the pandemic? So, because I know there are commemorations that take place every year as well as the memorials themselves. So how has the pandemic impacted on the responses to commemoration? So do you get a sense that there's a stronger impulse now to commemorate and memorialize, or has it been sidelined to a certain extent now that public focus has been directed elsewhere?
So actually the pandemic itself changed the commemoration of the event, since it was supposed to be the 5 years commemoration, which is a milestone in most of the process of mourning and passing from grassroots actors like Victims Association to a more official city or state-centered initiatives. So since the very first anniversary, we have commemoration, but silent one by the governments and the officials coming from one place to another. As you know, in November 13, the attack did not only take place at the Bataclan, but in several places in Paris. So it's a kind of deambulation, and but silent, no political discourse, no discourse at all. And each year, aside, and in addition to that, there is 2 commemorations made by the Victims Association, which are quite different. One is made mainly by young survivors, and the other one is made mainly by bereaved family. So, and they are not in conflict, but they don't always want the same thing. And this year was the first year where everyone was supposed to do it together. So it really, in a way, breaks the dynamics. So it gave also more leverage to the museum project I was telling you about, which is now the place where everyone is gathering, which is quite consensual between victim associations, the state and the city, because the city just said that they were going to give the building for the city of Paris for this museum, which led to negative reaction from other cities of France, because as you know, Paris is not by far the only city to have suffered a terrorist attack. So in a way, the pandemic stopped this dynamic, but gave more importance to the very institutional form of it. And also, it's striking to see how much the reference to the attacks is at the core of some of the projects, and especially the state project, which has been started regarding the memorialization of the pandemic. So maybe we are going to speak a little bit more about that with the next question by Stef. But it's also, in a way, we've been, in France, we had this, the way the Holocaust memorialization inspired and framed the way the attacks memorialization took place. And now the memorialization of the attacks is inspiring the way the pandemic is supposed to be memorialized.
Okay, I would like to move on, Sarah, to talk about the Windows in Lockdown project, which focuses on the ongoing pandemic and the lockdowns that were declared in response to it around the world. It's another fascinating example of how memory studies can address an event in the present while it is unfolding, rather than only studying the way distant historical events typically are being remembered. And as a historical event, of course, COVID-19 is very different in many ways from the Paris attacks of 2015. For one thing, the terrorist attacks were clearly localized in space and time. They hit one particular neighborhood in one particular city, and they did so at a particular point in time. I'm oversimplifying a little, obviously, because there were, of course, multiple attacks on multiple sites within that neighborhood in January and November 2015. But you get the point, right? It's a lot more sort of confined, much more localized, both temporally and spatially, than the pandemic. So COVID-19 is happening everywhere and looks set to last at least a year or two. Can you talk about the challenges in delimiting the sites of research for the Windows in Lockdown project, both spatially and temporally?
Thanks, Stef, for actually it was you suggested to bring the Windows in Lockdown collaborative project into the discussion today. Even if so far I haven't published about it, this project comes indeed directly from the Memory on My Doorstep 1. So as I said, in November 2015, my neighborhood became full of people, full of pictures, full of messages, and it created for me a new way of looking at my neighborhood and my everyday life. And in March 2020, which was when the lockdown started in France, we were authorized to go out for 1 hour a day. And so I did it, of course, and sometimes a little bit more. And when I did that, so everything was supposed to be empty. No one was supposed to be outside. And I was struck by, no one was there, but the number of messages at shop windows, private windows, on the walls, on the bus stop, etc., was huge. And so the thing is, in 2015, I had a kind of frustration because I wanted to take notes of all the flags, because one of the manifestation also was the fact that people put flags on their windows, and I was alone. I didn't know how to do that. I felt I was not in capacity to register all the flags in my neighborhood and in Paris and everywhere in France. So this time I thought, I'm going to do that, but I will need help. So I asked one colleague who works in France, but happened to be Italian, Marta Severo, and she's a professor in media studies, and she's specialist on all these collaborative projects. Because the question I wanted to raise was not really a memory studies issue. It was more, I was wondering, why do people display messages in public space while everyone is supposed to be in lockdown and no one is expected to read them? How do we talk about the lockdown and these messages displayed publicly? And what words and sentences do we use? Who does speak? So for those who want to know more about the project, you can Google Windows in Lockdown and add the acronym ANR. So this is the origin of the project. So if this is a memory studies project, I don't know. And in a way, it's kind of critical. So let me explain. I do not consider this project to be about memory. it kept traces of what already existed. So it didn't ask people for something that was not there already. They didn't ask people to tell their story. They asked people if they wanted to take a picture and collaborate to first an archival material. So it was not about expressing oneself. And even more, second point, even more, this project is born in a way from a kind of critical perspective to this blooming of COVID memory projects all over the world. Because everyone received so many things about writing their own diaries, testimonies, giving their vernacular objects, dream, etc., and became a kind of social emergency for each day. And I started Windows in Lockdown also as a form of reaction to that, in order to pay attention not only to the intimate and private consequence of the pandemic, which I consider, of course, a kind of unwilling tool of depolitization, the fact of focusing the collect on all this private, intimate thing. And I wanted to put back some more political and more public things into the picture. And actually, Windows in Lockdown goes in my research right now with a more global thing about registering and studying all this memory, COVID memory project. Where do they come from? Who participated? And how this COVID memory boom took place? Is it really a tool of expression of ordinary memory, and does memory can still be a tool of emancipation in this context? Or is it more a form of reappropriation by the state and society of a form of neoliberal memory being limited to the private sector, the ordinary expression of oneself, especially because social science have shown that we know that the fact of telling one story is not neutral from a sociological point of view. Not everyone has the capacity, the will, and the dynamic to think of oneself as authorized to do so. So this is how this articulates with a more memory studies perspective.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Looking at historical precedents, pandemics tend not to be very memorable, right? So it's kind of interesting that you bring a memory studies perspective to bear on the current pandemic. Take the Spanish flu, which failed to be memorable. It seemed to be completely forgotten in public consciousness, as Astrid Erl points out in a recent article in Memory Studies. And I was happy to see Astrid in the audience, by the way, so hi Astrid. But as Astrid writes in that article, the Spanish flu failed to mnemonically pre-mediate the coronavirus pandemic. Unlike the Second World War, for example, it wasn't available as a cultural model or as a narrative template to which we could turn to make sense of COVID-19. What mark, if any, do you think COVID-19 will leave on collective memory? Will it be possible to come to the same kind of consensual understanding of the pandemic as we have seen in response to the Paris attacks of 2015? Will there be something official to commemorate this historical event?
Thanks. This is a very important issue, and I read, of course, Astrid's article. I would not say that the Paris attack is a consensual memory, and that we even have a collective memory of the Paris attack. Actually, I think now that I'm definitely not very in favor of the term and the idea of collective memory at all. And actually, when we, for example, when we do survey about the relationship to the memory of November 13 among the French population, we see that the population who are more interested by these events are the one with the high level of education, the youngest group of the population in urban areas. The other, in a way, they don't care. And I don't know why and from which perspective should I blame them for that? Is it better? Is it wrong to care or not about these events? Does it mean something? So in a way, from a more political perspective, I would say I hope that we will remember the COVID pandemic more for its political consequence, which I hope will be numerous and important in terms of maybe change of the economic way of life, the political governance and so on, than for the memory of the event itself. But I must say that in France, if we stay in the context of the French society, some initiative from the state has started to foster, structure and frame the memory of the pandemic. So from the beginnings, the reference was about war. It was not only about the Second World War, but also about the First World War. And now they created a new institution called ad memoriam, which is from the Latin language, in order to collect all the collections are now being collected by the state in this project to try to, I quote, come together through the commemoration and through the memory of the pandemic to build a better future. So we have all this, in a way, all this vocabulary framing that comes from the post-conflict society or the transitional justice or the rebuilding of society, which is applied, the very same words, phrasing, which is applied to this new institution. I don't think it's going to work, but it exists. And the state really is putting a lot of money into that. And this institution gather not only curators, but also researchers. I'm not part of it. Researchers and also religious people, because it has really the pretension to build a kind of spirituality, I would say, which is very interesting in the French context, where everything is going to officially putting aside everything about religion. So this is the situation, but I don't think we will have any consensual memory about the events, which is not the case even for some event as November 13.
Mm-hmm. Okay, you talked about the way that the state is trying to produce the collective memory of the pandemic. I want to ask about the contribution that your project itself is sort of making to that effort, I suppose, right? So the Windows in Lockdown project finds you actively collecting instances of grassroots memorialization of the pandemic. And that's also true for your work on the Paris attacks, right? Memory on My Doorstep includes numerous photographs of the commemorative texts and images and candles and other objects left at or near the sites of the attacks. And you've just published another book, Les Mémoriaux du 13 Novembre, which contains hundreds of photographs of those ephemeral memorials, memorials that might otherwise be lost to posterity. Now, instead of positioning yourself as a detached observer who strives to maintain a certain distance from their research object, you actively help create the archive that will be available to future scholars working on the memory of these events. Do you consider it to be part of your responsibility as a memory scholar to become an active memory agent in this way. Do you have any concerns about that? Are there any risks involved in adopting such an interventionist approach, if I could call it that? And if so, how do you manage these risks?
Thank you, Stef, for this very challenging question. As I said, I'm a social scientist. So for me, I totally hear the contradiction you try to very politely point out. But it's, in a way, the permanent reflexivity and reflection on my own position towards my object of research is something I've been doing since I started to do any study. And actually, for example, I don't think I was the one making for the Paris Archive to collect everything. They would have collected anyway. So this being said, my responsibility as a researcher, especially from a social science perspective, which is by definition critical in the good meaning of the term, is to create the condition for anyone to put this material into perspective. And so to do that, I need, in a way, to take the risk of being instrumentalized or used, because it's a way I can collect all the information, all the materials which will help these things that are being curated and collecting to be studied from a full screen perspective, with all the knowledge of how they were built as sources, how they were used, why they were there. And the new book you referred to, it's very, I'm kind of proud of this book too, because it's a full study of the creation of this grassroots memorial from the very beginning, when someone comes there and puts something there. So it's ethnographic work on that, up to the use by the museum of these materials. And everything from a reflexive perspective, a critical perspective, putting everything at distance. So this is the way how I see my work, as someone which can help me first, other researchers, but also, and I think we are going to come back to that later, any citizen, to take their own distance towards these materials, which are, of course, Catherine spoke of emotion previously, very charged in emotion, in a lot of also of moral and ethical implication, and which is important. And I'm not someone without emotion, of course, but my work is trying to work on this emotion, not to become an objective researcher, because I think this doesn't exist on any topic, not only about memory, but on anything. The only kind of researcher objectivity we can build is by asking oneself continuously, why do we study what we study, from where we study it? Why with these methods? Why with these materials? And so this is why I've been doing that. As far as Windows in lockdown is concerned, it's precisely because I was saying that everything will be a lot of things will be collected, but nothing in the public space. So it was a kind of not counter archives, but more complementary and additional archives that I wanted to build, to try to build. Actually, it was, I'm not a specialist in this collaborative project, but my colleague Marta Severo said it's a huge success if you compare it with the average participation on this kind of project, because we had 1,500 participants, and we collected 4,000 pictures for France and 1,500 for Italy, and some for other countries, the first one being Belgium. So we have this material, and actually we've been really fighting for keeping that for the research, because now a lot of heritage institution and the state is trying to take it from us. I'm not fighting to keep them as a owner. It's just to preserve their scientific integrity, because I don't know in your countries, but for example in France, some people were fined and had police visit because they were displaying some critical political sentences and messages on their window, like criticizing the government or Emmanuel Macron. So we had this kind of materials also in our collects. And now we are building our own open access archive for everyone and independently from any institution. So if you want to use that, you can go. We try to do everything both in French and English. It's open for anyone. And a lot of different uses will be made from that, for sure. But for now, we try to say that, no, we are not going to give that to any curatorial institution. I don't know if it starts to answer your question.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's fascinating. Thanks for that, Sarah. I'd like to turn it over to Catherine.
Yeah, I'd like to come back to, well, I was really interested in what you said about this sort of COVID memory boom, which I guess also ties in with the question of emotionality in the research as well. But I have to confess, actually, during the first lockdown, I was personally very surprised to see there were so many research projects being announced so quickly. And I felt in some sense that they were sort of taking advantage, so to speak, of this new research context. And that sat very uncomfortably with me. I personally didn't feel like I was ready to try and process my experience of the lockdown while I was living it, but rather that was something that needed to be done after the fact. And Stef also mentioned to me that he had a similar experience back in March, even before Belgium officially went into lockdown. A colleague had invited him to join her research team in keeping COVID diaries with a view to possible future research about how people experienced this historical moment. And again, that ties into this sort of what you were saying about the intimate and private emotional responses to this versus the sort of more public and political responses. But when I actually read Memory on My Doorstep myself, I began to see a shift in my own thinking. I think it really helped me, particularly in terms of situating memory as part of a continuum. So the continuum of how we experience and learn to live with events. And I really love this idea of living with that you talk about quite a lot in the book. So you actually say it's no longer a question of how to live after, but how to live with something. But I suppose before I ask a little bit more about that, I wanted to ask, is there a right time to do this research? Is there a right time, post-terrorist attacks, or, during an actual pandemic? When is the right time to do this research?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, and since our academic world is very small, I was also approached to keep the kind of diary Stef referred to, and I also declined it. But the reason for it was not that I felt it was not the right time, but more because I strongly felt I did not have any legitimities to do that. Why me and no any other person? This difference from the previous projects, because the reason why I started to keep the Chronicle, which became Memory on My Doorstep, is because I had been working for years on the issue of memorialization, and I felt I have a scientific legitimacy to do so. Even if I embedded my work in my everyday life, it was first and foremost as a scientist that I did it. I did not feel the same at all during the lockdown, and I would never have told my story in any way because I don't felt as if I was something special regarding the pandemic. So rather than the issue of the right time, I would maybe rather raise the issue of the right angle from which to look at the events. And this is the angle which will determine if you need to work during the event itself or that putting yourself at work can wait. In the case of Memory on My Doorstep and of Windows in Lockdown, the way I wanted to work on the events decided for the fact of doing it now and not wait, because everything will be changed the time I start to work. And maybe to make things clearer in my mind, and if I can, I will switch for 1 minute from being a sociologist of memory to being a micro-historian of the Holocaust in Paris, who I am also in part of my works. And in fact, when November 13, 2015 happened, I had been working on the Holocaust in Paris from a micro-historian perspective for some time. And I then realized that the attention I paid to the social continuity and the ordinary dimension as a way to make sense of the crisis I was living at this time, at the right time, as you said, was exactly the same I had been using to study the implementation of the Holocaust in Paris, as embedded in everyday and ordinary life of Parisians, including the Jews. So here I was able to do that, even if it was in the past. But so it's not an issue only on time, it's an issue on how and what do you want to look at? To look at, as the things I wanted to look at for memory in my doorstep, I had to do it right now. But of course, I don't think that you need to do everything right now when you are a researcher. It depends on the way you want to do that. And maybe to add about this issue of time, which maybe comes to the issue of living with you were referring to. In the case of memory on my doorstep, and in a way kind of selfishly, I must say that adopting this reflecting view of what I was experiencing, in a way moving from being only an inhabitant to being a sociologist, helped me to overcome the situation, and also helped me as a mother to find a way to speak with my children, because I was speaking to them as a researcher also, and they were becoming junior researchers on the field with me, which created a way for us to move beyond the events and to manage to master the crisis in some way. Of course, you don't master everything, but it's also a way for us to live with and this event. So I will say the right time is the one you try to build as the best relevant one for what you want to understand.
Yeah, no, I think what you say about that sort of living with is really fascinating, and using research as a way of moving beyond something is equally fascinating. I'm wondering if there is a sort of almost cathartic element to that kind of memory work. But I think Stef's going to conclude now with a couple of questions about the future of this research, and perhaps that might also link into a possibility of it having a cathartic or therapeutic function. So I'll pass over to Stef again now.
Yeah, we wanted to ask a couple of questions, Sarah, about sort of the implications of your work for the future of memory studies as a field. I think I'll ask just one in the interest of time, because I think it's about time that we sort of invite questions from the audience. I'm sure people are sort of dying to ask questions of you as well. But let me ask just one question about the significance of the rather peculiar form of your book, Memory on My Doorstep. That is, it started out as a blog, a form of expression, as you note in the conclusion to the book, that is still unusual and iconoclastic among researchers in France. The blog or the blog entries became the core material of the book, which consists of a chronologically ordered series of entries framed in the English version by a new introduction and a conclusion. Would it have been possible for you to incorporate this very heterogeneous material into a traditional monograph, developing a coherent, overarching argument? Or did you feel that the nature of the research object did not allow for that and demanded a looser, more fragmented, more experimental, I suppose, approach? And do you consider the atypical format of this book a one-off, or could it serve as a model for future memory studies research, whether your own or other people's? And I got the impression from reading the book that the latter is in fact the case. In fact, you write at one point that the chronicle that you kept, and I quote, fulfilled my long-felt need to establish a form of narration that is different from those of academic studies. So I wonder if you could comment on that, Sarah.
Thanks, Stef. Actually, maybe it's the most important question of all for me. So if I want to make a short answer, I will say that no, it could not have been another format for the book. Why? So as you said, I started to do this work through a blog format in French, because I would say that we all, I think I don't betray anyone to say, by saying that we all went to memory studies as a field also for, not only, but also for civic reasons. We want to do, we want the world to be different. We want, we want some civic changes. And I will say that the few last years showed that maybe it's not that easy, and we did not all manage to reach our goals, as one of my last book stressed, or others like Leah David's one, or others. Anyway, and also I feel that there is a form of contradiction between having these civic implications we want to add in our work and publishing in journals that only 10 people in the world are going to read. So I was frustrating with that, and I was struggling with that. I also, before Memory on my Doorstep, I also did some podcast as a social historian of Paris. I have been trying to invent new formats. And the blog was also a way to immediately try to interfere and to have conversation with civic society. But of course, you're right, I could have written a new format for the book. Why not? Because I don't see my social role as only giving conclusions of my work for everyone. I want people to see how research is made behind the scenes. And in the book, in the blog, you also have questions I don't answer to, because I have the very naive conviction that you can make of anyone a researcher in social science. And it's what I want now, most of the things I produce, to be a way to give the opportunity to the people to see how the research is written first, is made. And secondly, to do this experience. That's why I reproduce so many pictures, because in my opinion, pictures can open interpretation. I make one interpretation of these pictures, but I'm clearly open to the fact that other people will see other things, which will maybe be very interesting in the research, and that they can, in a way, play to be the researcher also with this format. Yeah, I will keep it there to leave time for the Q&A. I hope it gives some of the answer you were looking for.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Sarah. That was fascinating. And I think on that note, we'll bring this conversation to a close, or at least we'll open it to questions from the audience. So just to recapitulate, there's two ways of asking questions. Either you can raise your hand, virtually raise your hand, clicking the raise hand icon in the participants panel, or you can simply put your questions in the chat, which I've just enabled, and then Catherine will read them out. She'll be monitoring the chat. So yeah, I think there's a first question in the chat. We'll sort of be, alternating between the raised hand and the chat questions, depending on how many there are. I don't see any raised hands yet. So Catherine, I suggest we... Pardon?
We have one raised hand. We have Susan Crane, and then we have a question then from Claire Launchbury. So if we take them in that order. Okay, sure. Yeah, Zoom seems to be a little slow over here because I can't actually see that raised hand. But if you can, Catherine, that's fine. So yes, Susan, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I can't seem to change the video, but I hope you hear me.
Yeah, don't worry about it. We can hear you. Okay.
Yeah, we do.
Thank you. I want to thank the panel organizers for this. This is a terrific presentation. And Sarah, thank you very much. You've given us a lot to think about. I'm struck by your caution and hesitancy to acknowledge your role as a mom and your children's role in your research. And I know exactly where it comes from, I think. I feel like we've all been cautioned and restrained, in fact, from including ourselves as mothers in our identity as researchers. But this is exactly what I want to ask you about, because I think if you need legitimacy, you don't have to go very far back, either in French sociology or in memory studies, to find that fathers have had no hesitancy about doing exactly what you're doing. For instance, Maurice Halbwachs, for instance, Bloch, right, in The Historian's Craft. And both of them say, I start with observations from children interacting with grandparents. I asked, my son asked me, what is the point of history, Daddy? Is one of the most famous lines in 20th century historiography. So do you have a sense that fathers have done it, but then they set it aside after the initial impulse, and then all of us concentrated on them as serious scholars, whereas mothers still have a different restraint on them, perhaps? I would love to hear you talk more about this. I'm one of those people who has cited my child in publications, and she's in footnotes too. So I don't have a problem with this, but what's your, what do you feel is causing your restraint and your hesitancy? And do you need encouragement to get over it? Or do you think professionally we need encouragement to get over it? Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. Actually, I'm happy to hear your voice. No, I don't need encouragement, but I always find having any kind of encouragement for anything, especially right now. So the thing is, first, as I said, it was very unconscious. I was not aware that I was doing that with my kids. In a way, I forced them. And it was only progressively that I managed to make sense of that. So actually in the French version of the book, where, as Stef quickly referred to, there's no general introduction and no general conclusion, I was not really aware of that, and I didn't really elaborate. But in the English version, I acknowledged that and really said to what extent it helped me to do better research. This being said, I think that it's not a very good strategy to seem legitimate in the field of research, not in memory studies per se, maybe, but more in general sociology, especially in France, where a lot of sexism is still on its way in academia. And sometimes my book, which is what it is, I'm not claiming it's an extraordinary book, but I think it's a book. It's a research book. It's also sometimes described by some male colleagues as a mom's book or something of an inhabitant, like it was some kind of a woman diary, like Madame Bovary in the 11th arrondissement, you know. So this is something I think we should claim, and which has heuristic and epistemological positive effects in our work, but which is also always has also some side effects in terms of perception and legitimacy in the field of research today.
So Claire,
but maybe maybe you're right. We should maybe write something, all of us, in memory studies or elsewhere, about using the children or being a mom in our research as claiming that as a resource, something positive and not something negative. Maybe it's a group project we could have.
Great, thank you for that question, Susan. And so if we go to Claire's question next, Claire, if you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, I'm muted. Can you? Great, thank you, Catherine, thank you, Stef, and thank you, Sarah, for really, really fascinating expose of two really, really interesting and related areas. I used to live in this quartier too, in the Rue Jean-Pierre Timbaud for years, and I remember going to Le Carillon just the day after my birthday, my 40th birthday, which was the day it reopened. And my question about it is to do with belonging. And it was very interesting how a lot of the people they're celebrating were not the usual people who would have been at that particular place, and how they felt it was appropriate for them to be there or important for them to be there in some particular kind of way, and how there's a sort of an appropriation. I guess it's a question about space and belonging to the quartier, but also then how people wanted to come in and somehow share in that as well. And can I just add another little second question, Catherine? Thank you. It's to do with chronology, and I love this idea of living with, and my work is on the Lebanese Civil War, which of course is over this long duration of 15 years. And we're very good about talking about trauma as an acute incident, and that memory kind of is working in a way to kind of either belatedly deal with this acute thing. And both the pandemic and obviously extended civil war are something chronic. And I think in clinical terms, even, we're much better at dealing with the acute than the chronic, because the acute, there's the sort of time frame of recovery, whereas the chronic is something else. And I just wonder where you feel, or how we can use this living with productively as both as something to work with in terms of thinking through memory studies, but also as a kind of healing, in the clinical sense of wanting to sort of resolve the trauma of chronic distress.
Thank you. Actually, I'm speaking to you from the crossing of Boulevard Voltaire and Rue Jean-Pierre Timbaud. The issue of belonging is very important. I will not be able to develop it into length right now, but actually, even among the victims themselves, I mean, the people who were there on the places where were shot sometimes and hurt, you have a distinction between the one who happen to be living in the neighborhood, they are from there, and the others. And the kind of relationship they build to the event is not at all the same. So we could extrapolate a lot about that. And you're right, the issue of belonging, but also the issue of de-belonging. Those who were those who left these neighborhoods, because some left after the attack, who were there socially, in which part of society are they from? The second remark is very, very important, and Jenny Wüstenberg is there, so she, and Stef also is part of this project. Actually, we've just wrote a huge project about the issue of moving from this idea of studying memory only through acute events, and to be on a more long perspective. We call that transformative memory and slow memory, and the idea of precisely paying attention to this more chronic event, but also to the way we deal with memory of things which are not always labeled as traumatic, like ecological transformation, economic transformation, which also produce a lot of violence, but are not specified at one date, one place. And I can say that maybe also the way the memorialization of the terrorism is changing in France right now is also linked to the fact that terrorism becomes chronic. It's not acute anymore. And this also, that's why maybe this framing of the museum changed through time from something more of an ethnographical museum, more of, as we say in France, musée d'ethnologie et société, than from an historical museum, which is something quite different to be from an ethnology perspective from an historical one. Thank you.
All right, we've got a couple more questions in the chat. And by the way, if anyone's having trouble raising their hands, just pop your name in the chat and we can call on you later on. But the first question then we have is, were the experiences and memories of Corona skeptics integrated in any way in the institutional memory of the pandemic in France? And if yes, how were they made sense of?
Great question. Actually, I don't think they are. Maybe they will be, because the only way I see to include them will be through this internet archives we have in France. So it's the National Library and the National Institute for Audiovisual Creation. I don't know the translation. INA and BNF, for those who know France, they have this system of collecting Twitter, collecting a lot of websites, collecting the internet. And so they pick topic and they do special collections around the topic. So I know that they of course, they collected a lot around the pandemic. So these people would have this corona-septic contents. But I didn't hear of any project which has been focused on this, and especially not the way the institutional memory of the pandemic has been framed. But I heard in a past roundtable with Michigan University, I heard a great project from Russia about the rumors. And actually they are curating all the rumors on the social network in relation to the pandemic in Moscow. And it was fascinating. And they are doing rumors trees to put in exhibition. If you're interested, I can send you this through personal email, but not in France.
Oh, that's fascinating. I think there's so much more to say about that and how it's going to unfold. We have another question from Marianne Hirsch. She says, I appreciate your urging us to remember the political dimensions of the pandemic and its handling by different states. But what about mourning the 1.5 million deaths globally so far? And how will these victims be remembered locally, communally, nationally, globally? As you all know, the US president does not even mention them. So again, a really fantastic question.
Yeah, of course, Marianne. It's but the question you're raising are political, and the fact you quote the US president's behavior is also political. So one of the issues is precisely to decide which scale is this event. Is it the local, the national, the global, the community scale? And most of the projects, the collection project I registered more than 400 so far. I used only 4 languages, but it's already something. Most of them are local projects, sometimes national, but very few of them are global. So this is also one of the dimensions I was saying. I decided to do Windows in Lockdown to put the pandemic memory into the public space, saying that the public space and the political things that happen there still exist. And maybe having some project at the global scale may be important as memory studies group to do also in order to participate in the way the pandemic will be framed. But in doing that, we need each time not to forget that we need also to have all these social different parts of society, since everyone is being seen as heroes, the people working at very important jobs, such as the nurses, people in the shops, etc. But so far, very, very few of them are anywhere in the collection. Not to speak about, for example, in the US context, all the Black people who died in such a proportion in the pandemic.
So we have about 5 more minutes if anyone has any final questions. Again, I can't see any raised hands, so please do pop your name in the chat if you have a question. And if not, Stef, do you have a final question? I know we had several, we have several more we could ask, but I don't want to monopolize the time.
There's plenty, right? But maybe, another question about the future of memory studies and how your work sort of, offers us a model or allows us to sort of envisage what that future might look like. Sarah, your work demonstrates very clearly what happens when our sites of research and our personal lives become intertwined. And following the pandemic, is this intertwining between personal life and research Is this going to be the new norm for memory studies scholars, do you think?
Actually, I don't think my work is going to, I don't have the pretension to think that my work is going to be a model for anyone. I don't know. I think that a lot of researchers are going to change the way they work in the future for a lot of different reasons, material ones also. For example, right now we cannot go on field work as we used to go. What is going to change in terms of memory studies from a very mundane perspective? How can you do interviews, do ethnography when everything is changing? You don't even allow it to do anywhere. But I think that we are at a new era for memory studies, but not because of my work, because of the fact that, as I said, more and more of us are kind of critical or skeptical about what the effect, social effect our work have produced. So now we are at a time where we need to think about what we can do differently in terms of research maybe, but also in terms of communicating about this research, implying other people in this research. And in a way, the development of the dMSA is one form of also of answer to this new challenge for the field, trying to be more integrated, to develop new kind of work, being both local and global, etc. These are all the challenges that are going to have to be met in the next years.
Yeah, I think that ties in with the final question I'd like to ask, because I want to come back to the emotionality of doing this type of research and the personal and public dimensions of it. So how, you know, while we're doing this kind of research, we're processing our own emotions and working with other people's emotions as well. So, and you talk about a sort of, you've developed a sort of hypersensitivity or a hypervigilance to everything now that's going on in your neighborhood, and you carry that into your other projects as well. So how can we do this type of work without those emotions becoming overwhelming? How can we sort of channel them meaningfully into the research? And I guess that also ties in with these sort of social changes that we're pushing for as well, I suppose.
I think we all have that. And that's also one of the reasons we came to memory studies one way and another at the beginning, because we do care, and caring is the first form of emotion in a way. So I think that one of the ways to do that is really to have a huge interest for methods, and to have really some full consideration for methodology. And sometimes, not in memory studies in particular, but in all my interaction with students and PhD candidates, this sometimes come at the end. I want to work on this topic, and the topic is first. But for me, the way I look to things and the methodology is first. Maybe it's the way for me to deal with emotion, to put methodology before anything else. And it's also because I was trained in social sciences in this perspective, in a very, very basic social science here in France, because we don't have memory studies here. I know that we are the country of Albrechts, but we don't have any memory studies diploma, any department, any research center. It doesn't exist. We don't have any studies at all. Maybe the first one to come are gender studies, but very few of them. So in a way, I think this methodological approach, which was the first one I was trained for as a very general sociologist, explains the way I approach memory studies from, in a way, a national perspective, because it was where I became a researcher, from how you learn it in France.
Well, thank you so much for that. I think you've given me and hopefully everyone else plenty to think about. We have to draw the event to a close now, but again, thank you so much, Sarah, for agreeing to take part in this fantastic conversation. Thank you to Stef and to Jenny, and also again, thank you for the support of the Cultural Memory Studies Initiative at Ghent University and the Newcastle University Centre for Heritage. And please, well, thank you as well to the audience. Thank you so much for joining us. And please do keep an eye out for the next digital MSA event that will be taking place in January, and that will be on the topic of necropolitics. So we hope to see you all there as well.
I'll be there.
Great.
In the audience.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Bye from me as well.